Welcome to Power Conversations and Connections with Susan. Thank you for joining the conversation. Here we talk life, the beauty and vulnerability, and the journey towards self love and evolving into our best selves. Um, I want to talk about the idea of me, right? We talked about confidence last time. And I believe for me, one of the biggest hindrances to me becoming confident early on or staying confident for longer periods of time was what I call the idea of me, the perception that I had of myself and the perception of those around me, right? So we have expectations, we have things that make our makeup. And my idea of me was different in my head and in my gut, like in here, in my heart. I didn't feel good about who I was projecting myself to be on the outside. Have you ever been like that? Have you ever had a situation where you're projecting something other than what you're really feeling? And I know sometimes we get into circumstance and situations where, that's the truth. That's our truth. That's what we do to get through. But I'm talking as a habit, I wake up in the morning and this is how I feel, but I'm not going to let that be shown. That's what I'm talking about, is my perception of me. I perceived myself on one hand to be a nice person and a kind person and a loving and a giving person. And on the other hand, I thought that was detrimental. Like, why are you so nice? Why are you so forgiving? Why do you allow yourself to keep being put into situations where you're the giver all the time, or that you can't find your way out of a situation because there's not any outlet for you, right? So it was my feeling of being trapped to a certain degree, if that makes sense. Being trapped in the fact that I wanted to be, but I wasn't. I knew that in some way I could, but my perception was that, oh, that's going to be too hard. You don't have enough to do that. You're not smart enough. And so it was a unequal balance. And of course, I'll tell you a story. Real life though, I don't make anything up. Is I was in a relationship. This was a little further along in my life. I had accomplished things, in at work, and I had accomplished quite a bit, right? But in that moment, I allowed someone to come into my life and convince me that I was different than who I was. Now, listen to what I said. I literally let someone come in and make me think that I was different who I was than who I was. And the reason that they could do that is because of the way that I perceived myself. Had I been walking in my truth, had I been really confident in what I was doing and what I had accomplished and who I was as a person, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that. They wouldn't have had the opportunity to literally get in my head and make me think other than what I really was. And see, so my perception of me made me cloudy, made me confused. And even though I was accomplished, this particular relationship, work relationship, just made it difficult to move forward. And what did I do? Instead of confronting the person, instead of talking about the elephant in the room, I began to believe what they said about me because I tapped into my inner perception, my inner lack of confidence, my inner judging myself. and not giving myself credit, I tapped into that instead of looking at what I had done, looking at what I had accomplished, valuing my own contributions. And of course, it was a man, in a male dominated world where I was at that time. It was a man, and he seemed to have it all together. And so, even though I was moving forward, I got stuck. I began to think like he perceived me because of my inner perception of myself. He kind of validated my own negativeness. So, in his words, in his stance, in his challenges, he kind of validated for me my own shortcomings. And it blocked me from seeing the other side. And so, I'm saying that to say, don't get lost in folding someone else's perception into your negative thoughts. How did I get out? Literally, was driving one day, headed into the workplace, and it just dawned on me. I literally remembered what I had accomplished. In that moment, I began to say to myself, not in nice words, but pretty much get yourself together. Get yourself together. Don't let someone take something out of your mouth. Don't let someone take something away from, your accomplishments simply because they happen to be brasher and bolder and more vocal and, a little bit more accomplished. Pound for pound, we're equal. He's done his thing in the workplace. I've done my thing. But if I don't get myself together and remember who I was and stop building on that negative perception of myself, stop looking at those past failures, those past behaviors that were not good for me, I was going to be in a bad place. So I began to adjust. And the biggest thing, I spoke to the elephant in the room. I had a confrontation, not a bad confrontation, not an unprofessional confrontation, but I let the truth be known. You have a different perception of me than what is true. And here's the thing, I have had some stuff that I allowed you to pull out of my head instead of looking at where I am now. Look at where you are now. And if you're not yet where you're going to be, don't let anybody stop you from getting to that point. Don't let anybody's perception of you stifle you from moving forward, especially your own. The idea of me wanting to be that girl that fit in, now mind you, I'm in the workplace for years at this point, but those things that started when I was young, those things that come up even after you work through them, like not liking, my shape, or being confident for a minute and then reverting back because of something somebody said, or some type of situation that reminded me of when I was less than. I had not let those things really go. I had not fully dealt with them. And so it was easy or easier for that person to come in and just reinforce that negative Susan, reinforce that fat and black girl who didn't think highly of herself. It was easy for them to do that. I let them, literally, because of the way that I felt. And so at some point, when I came to the realization, I began to say, no, that's not going to work. Now, mind you, from the time that I was driving to the time I had the confrontation, it wasn't in the same day, but I began the process. And I knew that at some point we were going to have a conversation. We was going to talk about this thing. I wasn't going to keep letting it go, because if I did, they were going to continue to think that what they were doing was okay. And I was putting myself in a position to be vulnerable, and I wasn't willing to do that. I've always said, I might not have always acted that way, but I've always said no one will take anything away from me as it relates to the workplace. No one tells me when to go, and no one's going to tell me how to go. So I wasn't going to put myself in a situation where I would be in that vulnerable state. So what do you do when you have that negative perception of yourself? That negative idea of you just following you around like a shadow, just stepping into the space anytime. What I did, it was one of the times where I really began my life of journaling. Now, I've journaled all my life, but I began to really journal and seek God, seek His wisdom, seek what I knew to be true about myself. And I began to get into my head and in a better space, and literally began to replace my negative with positives. And I was able to have that confrontational conversation without being ugly or unprofessional. But I changed the narrative. I changed the narrative because that person was never going to do it. And so that's what we have to do. We have to decide to change our own narrative. We have to decide to change those things that are stopping us from being our best self. And it starts with self-love. Now, can you go back? Could I go all the way back and change all of those previous years? No, I couldn't. But I could stop them from letting me enjoy what was coming forward in my life. That I could do. I became strong enough to do that. And that's what I'm saying to you. Become strong enough to confront your own negative perception, your own negative idea of you. Confront you so that you can stop other people from stepping into that space and making you feel like you're back there, giving you the reinforcing your lack. So remember, the idea of me. What is your idea of you? Is it real? Is it made up? More than likely, it's true, right? Because we come from good and we come from bad situations. So our ideas and our perceptions of ourselves, they're not always false, but sometimes they are false. Sometimes they help us to be comfortable. You know, if we say this, then that's an excuse not to do that. If I say this about myself, then I don't have to put in the effort to do that. If I say this about this situation, then I don't have to walk in forgiveness. We do that. So transparency. You got to be vulnerable, and you got to be willing to get your hands dirty to look at your perception of you and the negative perception of you. And what part of it is true, you work through it. And what part of it is false, you got to give it up. You got to stop telling yourself a lie about yourself. You got to stop telling yourself lies about situations that give you permission to not do good, you know? And so it's a growth moment, growth opportunity. We're not going to get to the beauty on the other side if we don't deal with our own stuff, our own crap, our own idea of ourselves. So the idea of me, what's the truth and what's not? Work on it. Continue to stick with us. Join the conversation. And let's evolve from this place. And let's put people in position to not do that, to not reinforce those things about ourselves and hinder us from living our best life. Thank you so much for joining. Like, share, subscribe all across social media at Susan Appleton. Y'all be good.